And here we are again in a live stream of the Federal Agency for Civic Education. And this is a real important moment for us because we start with the histoCON line. And before we will go to the official opening, I will talk a little bit with Charlotte Jans. She is one of the organizers of this meeting. Hello, Charlotte.
Hey.
Hi.
Nice to see you.
You're one of the faces behind the histoCON. Maybe can you explain us a little bit what is the idea of this meeting? What was the idea, and what you are doing and planning now in this special situation?
Yeah, so histoCON is the name of a project series that aims to look back and think ahead. And that means we focus on special points in history that are important for people all over the world, but with different narratives. So like May the 8th today, 1945, it was a liberation day and the end of World War II in Europe. But it is also a date of a massacre in Nigeria, and we don't need to forget that the World War II wasn't over then. It was still going on in the Pacifics. And histoCON aims to bring young people from all over the world together to share these different narratives and ask, what does history have to do with me, and why is it still important today? That's what we wanted to discuss. And sorry, my English is not so good today. So that was what we wanted to discuss with 500 young people we initially had invited to Berlin, and that's where they would be right now.
But they are not there. I mean, everybody's sitting at home. The plan was to bring them together. That was planned a little bit different, like we see it as far as we know. What we are doing now?
We're doing now is an exciting online program with activities, lots of activities to explore. So our first live talk will start in a few minutes when this is over, when our talk is over. And for a lot more, just browse histocon.de and you'll find the first episode of our podcast and statements and videos from people from all over the world, what they think of 8th of May 1945, and also a digital excursion through Berlin's commemoration landscape where we initially would have been. And much more. And it also doesn't stop today. We will carry on publishing exciting content until we can meet again in person.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for this interesting overview about what we are going to expect for the histoCON line. Now we will hand over to the official opening, and I will give the mic to Cosima Gill. She is from Germany, and Cosima is a professional moderator. She's working for the Westdeutschen Rundfunk, the German broadcasting, and I'm very interesting who are invited for the official or for the first talk. So Cosima, you've got the mic.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very glad to host this histoCON line today. And it's actually the day we would meet in Berlin, everyone in person, as you were mentioning beforehand. 500 young people were supposed to meet, but instead we're sitting at home, sitting in our living room, sitting in front of the laptop, maybe in your home office if you have an office. At least it's very different from what we expected, but it's still great that we are able to meet and discuss on this special day. This festival was supposed to be connected to the official state ceremony and high representative like Frank-Walter Steinmeier or our Minister of Foreign Affairs, but we are doing this online instead. Today, as you mentioned already, we're going to talk about the significance of the 8th May, the day the World War II ended in Europe 75 years ago. And the claim is from histoCON line, look back and think ahead. And this is what we're going to do now. We're going to look back and think ahead. We're going to look at the World War II and how it is perceived today in different regions from different parts of the world. What can we learn for the future, and which different ways of commemorations are there? This festival, I want to mention that again because I think it's great that you're doing this, is organized by the Federal Agency for Civic Education. And I already checked out this morning a lot of the videos which are published online on the website histocon.de. And I have seen a few videos which were sent in by a young audience, because you have started a challenge called Histo Voices, and young people from all over the world have been sending videos from their personal connection to World War II, what we can learn from it today and how it should be remembered. And I think one of the stories was very touching. I would like to show you that video. The video was sent from Misato from Japan, and we made a professional video out of it. And I just wanted to give you a brief example to show you one of those videos you can discover on the website histocon.de. Could you just play it, Daniel? That would be great. Thank you.
I come from a Buddhist family. My father, grandfather, and generations before them were priests. We have a bell tower in our temple, but we don't have a bell. As a child, I asked my father, and he answered that the Japanese army took the bell during the World War II to make bullets out of the iron. I was really shocked and surprised how desperate the Japanese army was, that they needed irons even from a Buddhist temple. We still don't have a bell as a silent reminder of what happened during the war. Japan attacked other countries, and it should never happen again. But 75 years after the war, for the first time, Japanese government trying to change the constitution and trying to build a military force. And thinking about today's situation with the coronavirus, I am a little bit afraid because the media is only reporting about the news around corona, which is not bad, but I'm a little worried about the Prime Minister trying to pass the relevant laws that will make him easier to change constitution in the future. That's I'm a little bit concerned of.
Yeah, I think this is an aspect you probably didn't really pay attention to beforehand. Neither did I, to the exact development in Japan. And it shows that we always need to look at those special days, those anniversaries, like 75 years after the Second World War, from different angles and from different parts of the world. So I want to encourage you, if you have any questions, please send them in our live stream, and we will answer all the questions later in the debate. And yeah, you can follow us on, for example, Facebook and YouTube, and just post your comments there and we will include them. I want to first of all introduce our panel guests. We invited 3 guests, and I'm very thankful that you're taking part in our discussion today. First of all, I would like to introduce Karolina Wigura. She's from Poland. Hi, Karolina. I will briefly introduce you to the audience. You're a sociologist, historian of ideas, and a journalist. And Father Karolina is the head of the Observatory of Public Debate of Kultura Liberalna. That is one of Poland's centrist think tanks. And you're an assistant professor at Warsaw University Institute of Sociology. So we're obviously going to talk with you about the Polish perspective on this day. Then I'm very happy to welcome in this panel Wangûi Wa Goro. She's from Kenya, and she has served as a translator, academic, editor, campaigner for human and cultural rights. And while reading your CV, I have read a lot about many different positions. And you're best known for your work in literacy translation. And I'm also very happy to welcome you here And we're going to talk about the African perspective on many of the issues today. And last but not least, we have Dmitrij Kapitelman. He's an author and journalist from Germany. He was born in Kiev, and he's now living in Eastern Germany. And his first book was published in 2016, and it was a book about his Jewish identity. His book was called The Invisible Father Smile. So I think we have three very interesting guests here on the stage, and I want to encourage the audience, keep on sending questions to us. We will obviously answer them at the end of our discussion. But first of all, we will start with a small round discussing with each other. So I would like to know from all of you, maybe you could answer that question briefly. What is your personal connection to the 8th of May? Maybe a family history, or what is the first aspect you've been thinking about this morning when you woke up? I'm very curious about your individual access to that topic. So let's start. Who would like to start? Maybe Karolina?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. So I've been thinking about the date, and the first thing that came into my mind was the film, a beautiful film by the late Andrzej Wajda, an Oscar winner. The film is called The Ashes and the Diamonds, and there is a beautiful scene in the film. Two men are talking about the war. The war is already the past, but it's not long ago. It's just a few years after. They are still young, and they are thinking about the people with whom they fought. And all of the colleagues, all of the friends are gone. And basically, when Wajda is doing this film, when he's shooting this film, there is a censorship in the communist Poland, so he isn't allowed to say too much. So the only thing they do to remember the people with whom they were together, soldiers fighting for freedom, is the symbol of the glasses. So they put glasses with vodka on the table and they light every glass. So the lights, the fires are the symbol of the people who are already dead. But because of the censorship, they are not allowed to say what army they were in and what they were fighting for. Because when I'm thinking about the 8th of May, and I think I'm not only talking about the Polish experience here, I would rather say I am talking about the post-communist experience, is there is no 8th of May. There is no Liberation Day. Because for post-communist Europe, the 8th of May simply means another occupation. So I think it's an extremely important date, because this is a date where two halves of Europe are falling apart for several decades, and it has tremendous consequences, because after 1989, we started to sew the Europe again together, and we can see that it's still a very difficult process and that there is so much to be done yet.
Thank you. That is a very interesting aspect. So what have you been thinking about today, Dimitri?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Actually, since I was born in Kiev, in Ukraine, I used to celebrate the 9th, not the 8th, because that's the Russian counting, I guess. And I recall my father opening a letter on the 9th of May from Germany, basically granting us the right to move to Germany from Kiev, the visa and everything. And it has already been the day of victory, but since on that day our Jewish family was invited to Germany, it became the double day of victory, and we had a good laugh about it.
Okay.
From a more German perspective now, since I've been living here for 25 years, and especially from a more Eastern German perspective, this date doesn't feel like a cause for celebration. It does feel like a day you should honor, but since fascism is not defeated and the right-wing movement in Germany is so strong right now, it's I don't feel too celebrative, or I don't know what's the right term for this. And also, what's happening in Germany now is a strong shift of cultural memory, I would say. Some of it pushed by right-wing parties, and some other things not that intentionally. I give you an example. So I was reading in Spiegel that around 30% of Germans think that their family was somehow targeted by the Nazi regime and somehow they were victims, when actually it's a percentage less than 1%. It's like 0 dot something. What I'm trying to express here, I guess, is that there's a strong shift against the stigma of a German guilt. Of course, it's not a stigma, but there's a lot of unwillingness in the German society to keep on accepting this burden as a thing that should be relevant nowadays, at least from my point of view.
Thank you. And now I would also be interested in your opinion, Wangui. What have you been thinking about today? What is your personal access to this day?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me and for having me here. When I woke up today, I remembered that my uncle fought in the Second World War in Burma. And many people from my community fought in the war in Burma. I must apologize that I'm getting feedback on the reception. And the other thing is that I have a very close friend of mine whose name was William Ash, and he wrote a book called Under the Wire because he was jailed during the Second World War in Germany, and he passed away. But that was another thought that I remembered. And then a third thought that I had was there's a small Italian church in Kenya, in the Rift Valley, of the Italians who were prisoners of war during the war in Ethiopia. And they built the road in Kenya. And my first contact with the Second World War was when I was 5 years old, when we visited this church. And my parents explained to me that we had been, as Kenyans, involved in the Second World War. So those were the first thoughts. But of course, I've been doing my own research and cultural work with colleagues, Black colleagues, in a project on Black women's bodies in Europe. So I met amazing women called Adefra, who have taught me so much about the connections of Africa and women in the Second World War, because some of them are products of that war. They were born because their fathers, who are from Africa, were fighting, or one way or another were involved in the Second World War. So I had lots of thoughts, and we can continue to explore the complexities of the Second World War. For some, it's a day of joy. For others, it's a remembrance of not a very positive time in history. I'd like also to point out, for those who may not know, that most of the countries in Africa were under colonial rule, under Germany, under Britain, and under France during this particular day. Mm-hmm. And when the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights was established, most African countries were still colonies. So we need to look at this as a complex day for people in different parts of the world.
Thank you very much for your introduction round. I guess what became very clear that it is complex and it has to be approached from many different regions and aspects. I would like to know from all of you, which is the main narrative used in your region while talking about the Second World War? How can you still feel the impacts from the Second World War until today? And what can we maybe learn from that, or which lessons can be drawn from the way there are narratives in your regions? We are talking about Eastern Germany, about Poland and Kenya, but also your areas of research. Maybe you can, let's talk about the narratives And maybe let's start this time. Whoever feels to start, let's start to discuss.
Well, maybe I should go ahead since I already touched on the subject of narratives. As you can imagine, in Germany, a quite deeply rooted one. So the narrative of the German responsibility is or should be part of the state. And as I mentioned before, one of the underlying promises of the right-wing party is to provide some sort of relief from this historical responsibility. Sometimes it's more aggressive, like Bernd Höcke from the AfD calling the memorial in Berlin somehow a building of shame for the German people.
Maybe briefly, we should mention for our international audience that who the AfD is. Maybe you can just explain that in a phrase.
That's basically the most successful right-wing party right now. And for instance, their leader, Gauland, just I think it was yesterday, gave an interview and said, no, this is not a day for celebration. This is a day where a lot of Germans, a lot of things were lost, and there was even a provocative note to it. We lost on that day. We lost a lot of abilities to create, a lot of room to create, which is, if you're Jewish, really disgraceful. Because what does that mean? You lost the ability to create. So it's obviously a counter narrative, and this is not somewhere in the backs of Facebook or the internet. This is the strongest opposition party in the German parliament right now. So I feel like the narrative of the Shoah and the Holocaust is threatened, and then I don't mean by a small amount of people. I mean it's greatly threatened now in Germany.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. How is it perceived in your regions?
Is this question still for me?
No, I was maybe Karolina, or which narrative are we talking about for you or for you, Wangui?
Yes, if I may come in, I've heard both these narratives across my life. I'm a translator, so I try to live between these two narratives because, as we said, there's the whole colonial question. A lot of people in Africa don't even have this knowledge. They haven't seen the artifacts that are related. We haven't heard the stories from the people who suffered. There were thousands of African soldiers who were conscripted. As you heard from Algeria, a lot of soldiers were killed on the 8th of May in North Africa. So I think as we go forward, it's really important for restitution and reparations for us to continue having these conversations so that people know the truth. Otherwise, there'll remain tensions and unhappiness and could lead to negative impacts in the future. People's stories are not allowed to surface.
And which narrative did you come across mostly, Karolina?
So, when you look at Poland and where it is on the map, it is basically somewhere in the center between Germany and, of course, it only has a very small part of a border with Russia, but there is also Russia on the eastern side, and it's very important because the Polish way of thinking about memory, history of the Second World War and of the 20th century, is somewhere in between the German culture of memory and the Russian culture of memory. Now, the German culture of memory, the dominant line, is a culture of memory where you think about two distinctive groups, perpetrators and victims. The Russian culture of memory is basically about heroes, perhaps also sometimes about victims, but it's mainly about heroes. So Polish culture of memory is somewhere in between. And I think it's a very interesting uniqueness of the Polish position on the map and also position as for the history is that it is somewhere in between those cultures. Now, this had a very important consequence after 1989. For almost 30 years, we were trying to build a very unique culture of memory. Culture of memory, I mean the way history is taught and the way collective remembrance is being reconstructed. So this was a very pluralist model. Pluralist meaning that it depicted Poles during the Second World War as playing very various roles. The roles of victims, the roles of heroes, the roles of perpetrators, and the roles of bystanders. And I think it was extremely important because it taught us not only that there were some people who were behaving good and some people who were behaving bad, but also that these roles could be in one biography. I like to talk about my grandfather, one of my grandfathers in this context. He was a pre-war classic cultural anti-Semite. And during the war, he was sending weapons to the Warsaw Ghetto. So he was a person who actually changed his way of seeing the world during the Second World War. And I think it's an extremely important lesson. Now, the problem is that, of course, in the past 5 years, under the new rule, we have somehow ended up with this pluralist way of seeing history, and the main narration we are seeing now is the narration which shows us as heroes and victims, nothing more. I think it's a pity, actually, because it doesn't let us learn more complicated and more valuable lessons from history.
What we were just hearing from you, I kind of want to sum it up because I think it's very important, is that there are different ways to see the narrations from today. And what I was thinking was very interesting from your perspective, that you were differentiating between the Russian narration and the German one, whereas in Russia you would see it rather from a hero perspective and here rather for victims and perpetrators. And I have just been watching the speech before this panel from our president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, and he was mentioning as well something you have been talking about, Dimitri, and he was also saying that it is very important to still see the responsibility we have as Germans. So I think the different narrations teach us many different aspects, and it's important to bring those narrations together to get a bigger picture. Karolina, I have one question also for you right now, because I'm very interested in an article you wrote. I read that you were saying that the European project was based on one particular fear, the fear of the past. In German, we often say the expression nie wieder, which means it should never happen again. So what resulted from this fear? Because Europe was built after the Second World War so that that would never happen again. But what resulted from that fear, in your opinion? And what can we learn from it from the future when it comes to the aspect of fear?
Yeah, so I think a lot of my work is connected and devoted to emotions, because I think we only rarely think about emotions and how important they are. And as for how I'm thinking about emotions, I'm very much influenced by Spinoza, a 17th century philosopher who basically thought emotions are first before politics. So before we start politics, we have emotions. And so we really have to be very conscious about the emotions that are the fundamentals of our political order. So I believe that after the Second World War, Western Europe and basically Western world was heading to liberal democracy, and we know that it's a commonly recognized fact. But only rarely do we ask, why was it? Why liberal democracy seemed such a great solution? And one of the answers to this is the answer which concerns emotions, and namely that there was a huge fear of the past. That basically the fear of the past, the fear of the atrocities, the fear of another world war coming back, occurring again. This was the fear that finally stabilized Europe, which was a very unstable continent for a long, long time. The problem is, of course, Cosima, that the fear of the past, as any other emotion, fear also evaporates. And fear of the past evaporated with the generations changing, with globalization of memory, because, of course, the European model of thinking about past is only one of the models.
So what happens if fear evaporates? Is our basis missing?
So I'm afraid that, so I'm afraid that fear is a very strong emotion, and it leaves a very yawning void. So it left a void, and for some time, European politics, or rather liberal democratic politics, was looking for something that could go into this place of fear. And I'm afraid that the first ones to understand this were actually the illiberal populists, who provided the fear of the future. So they said, be careful, the immigrants are coming, be careful, you're not going to find a proper work because the refugees are coming.
So what you're saying is that the populists were better at dealing with fear, and that's why they were on the rise, if I understand you correctly.
Yes, I basically think the populists have been and still are better with dealing with emotions.
So let's come. I might just interrupt you here, and we're coming back to you later. I would continue this question with Dimitri, because he also wrote something. He's a journalist, and he wrote something about the phrase "never again." He said in one article that "never again," niemals wieder, is an empty phrase which has not exactly a meaning anymore in 2020, 75 years after the end of the Second World War in Europe. Could you elaborate on that? Why do you consider "never again" in 2020 rather an expression as an empty phrase? And what has the rise of the populism to do with it? Because this is, I think, where we find the connection to Karolina, what she was talking about beforehand.
Well, I probably have to add that while writing this, I wasn't in a really good mood, I would say. You had a lot of right-wing terrorism happening in Germany. And I just came from a hospital where a doctor basically told me, look, everybody here is voting for AfD. Everybody here is voting right-wing. The doctors, the nurses, the policemen around, they're all for it. So at this point, I wasn't particularly in a good mood. But even factually, I still think that we are not at a never again stage as a society and as multiple societies. We're just not. There are camps. You have camps in China. There are camps right at the European border. Look, the idea of a human politics all around the globe, it's not a real thing. And if you look around, dictatorship and populism is rising. So the phrase "never again" and anti-Semitism is the same thing. It's on the rise. I give you another example. I think 2 days ago I was reading about an Israeli doctors actually making great steps in finding a cure, not a cure, but maybe some medicine fighting COVID, right? Fighting Corona. And my first thought was, oh my God! So if an Israeli company finds the cure, I hear the anti-Semitism screaming. Of course, they found it because they invented it. That's how it goes. So they profit. And like, this was my first reaction. I knew that there's another wave of anti-Semitism coming just for Israelis finding a cure. That's insane. And before I forget, as Karolina said, they are better with dealing emotions. I would like to rephrase that. They don't deal with emotions at all. They economize them just better. They manipulate it in the political process. They not really deal with it. They just exploit emotions in a really toxic way. And as a certain type of politician, and by that I mean a Democrat, one who respects science and facts, you can't exploit emotions like that because things aren't so clear and they surely are not so predictable and so black and white.
I would like to
I would like to say something. Yes, in Africa, because of the way we came into our democracies, coming out of colonialism and slavery, the narrative for us has been quite a different one. It's one of hope for freedom, as you saw with the liberation of South Africa from apartheid, which is not a very long time ago. So we're aware of the extreme tensions on the other side, but our experiences and the way Europe has emerged from such a difficult moment have been moments of developmental hope, if you can call it that. So our research as Black people, which has come very late from the Western discourses, I'm sure you know that there's a very big decolonial movement. And decolonization doesn't just mean people who were colonized, but it also means people who were colonizers. And all these big movements, Black Lives Matter, the young women, they're very aware of the importance of freedom, and people in Africa and the diaspora, and I'm sure the young people are very aware of the importance of hope and survival. So I think we need to encourage the young people to continue to know these stories and their own place in securing their futures. I don't think that the narrative of fear is the only narrative. There's the other corollary of that, which is hope. And the pandemic now is showing us that we have to have hope. Otherwise, we'll be on a suicidal pact. But we've learned from the genocide in Rwanda. We've learned from all these things and the survival of Europe that another world is possible.
Wangui, we talked yesterday on the phone and you've told me something which I thought was very interesting. You've traveled a couple of times to Germany and you told me that you were impressed quite a few times how the country has built up after the Second World War based on forgiveness and understanding. I think that is how you called it. And then you were comparing it to Rwanda and you were saying there are some aspects which are interesting in the way Germany was dealing with its past. What did you learn from it? And maybe you could explain us again why that impressed you, this forgiveness and understanding, and how that could be used in different contexts. You just mentioned Rwanda, for example.
Yes, thank you very much for this. I think when we spoke, I was saying that this question is, people don't get away from the pain, I think, as Karolina was saying, that emotions are really important. But it's how people live in this complexity going forward. You're aware that maybe this is a victim and this person was a perpetrator. And what we saw with the truth and reconciliation in South Africa, that people could actually meet the person who tortured or killed the person and learn to actually love them. And in Rwanda, I'm sorry, I had brought a book that I wanted to share with you by a woman who wrote her experiences during the genocide in Rwanda. And she said she had to live. Her name is Yolanda Makasanga. And she said people even intermarry with people who in the recent memory caused atrocities in their families. So we're not saying that we should forget the bad things that happened, but we must actually amplify them. And we must bring the stories through artifacts. We must bring the stories through narratives, which we spoke at the beginning. And we must face these pains of forgiveness, of anger, of intolerance, because they're always very close to the surface. And we are very fragile as human beings. So just hearing one narrative of fear, I think, is not the only fear. There's pain, there's joy, there's love even. And I gave the example of domestic violence, which is happening now with the coronavirus, and how at the same time, people who love each other, who have voluntarily chosen to be in relationships together, yet there's violence, even within the pandemic. And how do we learn from the lessons of history and these cohabitations of Europe, of Africa and Europeans, which continues to this day? They're complex. But I think the young people are not encumbered so much by these histories because we have moved the narrative forward. For each generation must build on these stories of hope and not to suppress our emotions. And I think Africans probably are more, an African diaspora, we have been more open to addressing our pain from the past. And we also know that it's all around us. Like I'm here in Côte d'Ivoire, which, was a former French colony, and the emblems are everywhere. When I go to Germany, and I've actually written a story about Berlin, is that in the physical space, you can see these stories cohabiting every day. So I think it's to continue pressing for hope.
We have, so we talked about the narrative of hope and fear. Karolina, did you want to answer? Because I had the feeling you just approached the mic. I can't hear you. Can you turn on your microphone, please? Thanks.
I would love to follow up on that, on two things, on forgiveness and on good emotions. So the first thing I would like to say is less optimistic. I think we have to be aware that something has happened to the European institution of political forgiveness, and it's not a very positive thing. So forgiveness in politics has been invented after the Second World War to basically come up with the terms of the Second World War. It allowed people from different countries to talk with each other on the human level and not on the level of nations that were feeling a lot of pain. And it has been, in this way, a very important institution for European diplomacy. So, all those politicians holding hands, embracing each other, speaking of forgiveness, this was an extremely important supplement to diplomacy. And as such positive phenomenon, it also has been globalized in the decades after the Second World War. But I'm afraid that this epoch is gone. and that today memory is less a tool of diplomacy and it's more a cynical tool of elections. Namely, memory is being used in order to gain votes. And it's a very, very important change because when you think, for example, about Willy Brandt, who fell to his knees in Warsaw in 1970, he did that with, I think, with full consciousness of how difficult this gesture was in 1970 for his compatriots. So he had the courage to do that, and thus he changed the face of Germany. With decades, his gesture became a symbol. But today, politicians are not doing gestures connected with memory in order to show courage. They don't risk. Just on the contrary, they look for votes. That's why they only tell their voters things that the voters want to hear. They don't say anything difficult to them. So this is, again, something about populism, I'm afraid. Another thing is, of course, about good emotions, and I would like to be more optimistic here. So people who defend liberal democracy are often quite skeptical about emotions because, well, they have good reasons. They think emotions have led to radicalisms, totalitarianisms, war in the 20th century. And of course, it is true, when emotions are manipulated, they can make a lot of harm. But I would like to suggest another approach to emotions. I think that if the defenders of liberal democracy really want to defend it, they have to do it passionately. And this means that they also have to spread positive emotions. And it's just exactly as it was said before me. Hope for a better future, empathy for others, I think are the core emotions that could build better politics for the 21st century.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we could ask one question to Dimitri in this context, because you have been saying how we could approach the rise of populism in a certain way. So Dimitri, you have been mentioning happenings in Germany, which we remember: Hanau, Halle, and Kassel. They were events during the past month which were very difficult for the whole society, and those were events where either Germans or German with a background of migration were killed, shot because of racism. And I would like to know from you, how do you perceive the situation in Germany, especially in Eastern Germany, as this is where you're currently living right now? And how do you think could we approach the rise of anti-Semitism? What should be done, in your opinion?
Oh, that's an easy one.
I mean, we talk about it in society and we publish news pieces on TV, but I guess talking is not enough.
Well, referring to what has been said, of course, like Wangui said, you need some sort of forgiveness. You need some sort of emotional exchange and honest one. The problem with that is that this is not the business model of populism. It's just not. It's the opposite. That's how they get votes. They do everything to avoid this type of reconciliation and honest dialogue. So, and again, as Karolina said, if you're defending liberal democracies, you have to spread positive emotions. You can't just be on your high horse and say, "Look, history proved us right. You're assholes." This is not how you gain momentum, but it is hard. When things like Hanau happen, and some right-wing voters online openly mock people, openly mock the victims, it's hard to be the positive one. It's hard to have this sort of open, let's talk and embrace each other and have a hug moment. And it gets even tougher once you realize how much racism is how deeply it is rooted in just those systems that should protect you, like the German police and the secret, not the secret service, but the Verfassungsschutz. I'm not sure how to translate that. Anyway, so I find it really hard to, be the always forgiving and constructive part. And
Yes,
not
I would.
not only because I'm stubborn, but because when you do so, mostly you're met with even more grief and even not grief, but even more aggressive behavior, and it's just you get stomped up on emotionally. So this is tricky, and
Wangui wanted to add something, I think, and after that I would come because we to a few questions. We got a lot of questions. So Wangui, could you briefly answer, and then we come to a few questions? Thank you.
I think this last point that Dimitri has made is very important, that we cannot delude ourselves about the reality, particularly about racism, especially in the metropolitan cities where there are migrants. And also we've seen anti-Semitism on the rise. And it's at vulnerable moments in the world that these ugly sides of humanity rear their heads. Some of it stems from fear, as we spoke about earlier, but also from ignorance. Therefore, having these conversations and for young people to discover for themselves the truths, however they interpret them, having these issues in the museums, in the curriculum, and allowing education. Most of the people that I have met from Europe do not even know that their countries were involved in colonial wars. Secondly, people who have suffered from these acts of violence and increasing violences such as racism, they're not passive bystanders. There's been a big pushback globally against racism across the world and against anti-Semitism. And also we talked about diplomacy. People out in the world in this modern age of technology and almost common knowledges because of digitalization, people are not passively receiving diplomacy. There's increased dialogues and conversation. But I think the most important point is the one that Karolina made, and the one that I hear very often from young people, young women and young men and women, is that people beyond their governments are building relationships, the ability to connect through the internet. People can push back against those trolls. The young techies on both sides, that they have attack and counterattack. So these conversations are going on in society. I've seen big demonstrations all the time in Europe of people pushing back against racism in large numbers, people protecting and defending people who are victimized. So I'm not saying that it's going to be easy. We have to win the hearts and the minds. And even on the intellectual questions about liberalism, it was a liberalism that refused to acknowledge even the atrocities, for example, of colonialism. So because it wasn't taught to them. So,
I guess, sorry to interrupt you, but I think we have to come to the questions because I get so many and it would be a shame if we don't answer. It would be great if you could try to answer within less than 1 minute because we have so many. Let's aim for that, okay? For all of you. Let's start. One of the questions we just received here is kind of what you've just been talking about. One of the questions from Paulina Adeleke is, Wangui mentioned young people don't know much about their history. What can be done to involve more young people globally and continue this kind of conversations? Maybe one of you could answer, what are your ideas about it?
I could start. I think that exchange programs are very important. People should be able to visit each other. I think culture and literature and movies and translation are really critical at this time. But for young people, have all this access to the internet on platforms such as this one. So there need to be more dialogue, more engagement, and more debates in democratic spaces. But I think travel, it opens the minds even of the most hardened person. When you travel and you find that there are human beings elsewhere, it will change you.
Yeah, when we can travel again. Right now, traveling is difficult. We got a question from Ankita Sharma. How do we correlate memory, gender, and constructivism today for global democracies? Who would like to answer within less than 1 minute to this complex question?
If I could answer, because we talked about gender, that feminists, for example, have given us a very good model. They've been working collaboratively. It's one of the largest global movements in the world. And I think the centering on the materiality of life, not on fake news or on projections that are unreal, or I think addressing the truth of how people actually live their material lives and what is possible, the futures that we can construct together. So, for example, there's something happening in the African and African diaspora world which is looking beyond dystopic futures. So the whole idea of Afrofuturism coming from feminists and women, young women, for example, I have found extremely exciting. And some of it is actually coming from Europe and from Germany. You'll be very surprised.
Thank you for your answer. We got another interesting question. Do we need more personalities like Willy Brandt and Richard von Weizsäcker in politics? Peace politicians full of conviction. Who would like to answer that? Do we need more of such politicians?
Well, if I can answer that, I think, honestly, I think that we need less boring politicians. I believe that populists have been so successful because they are so engaging, entertaining, I would say. And I'm not saying this to praise them, because of course they win elections and then they use this entertainment and being engaging in order to demolish institutions and the rule of law. So I'm not praising them, but I'm stating the fact. I believe that we live in an epoch of infotainment, and we have to take it seriously. Politicians in my part of Europe, so for example in Poland, in Slovakia, in Hungary, who were proponents and defendants of liberal democracy, and at the same time they remembered to be entertaining. So, for example, the mayor of Warsaw, Mr. Trzaskowski, or the mayor of Budapest, Mr. Karochan, they all have this idea that they have also to be entertaining, engaging. And I think this is the key to what we should expect now from politicians. Passionate defending of liberal democracy, but also being aware of what tools we are using.
Thank you. So a bit more entertainment in politics from your perspective. Let's approach Dimitri with the next question. Peggy Pische wants to know, what is the educational meaning of the title from this conference, Look Back, Think Ahead, from your point of view?
Come again, please?
Yeah, what is the educational meaning of the title Look Back and Think Ahead from your point of view? What do you connect with the title from this debate? Look back and think ahead. I guess that leaves a lot of space for interpretation. It comes from Peggy Pische.
Does it? I thought it's kind of straight, know your history in order to know your future thing.
Yeah, but I guess it's kind of like that. But what is it for your? What is the educational meaning from your point of view? What do we need to keep in mind for the future? I mean, there are many aspects we can look back at.
Well, since we wonder what lessons there are to be learned from history, I guess this is also what this all is about. It's not rocket science. You know where nationalism leads. Please don't build your policies on degrading minorities. It's 2020. We should have learned that by now. It's please don't try to build your policy on cheap emotions like fear and like xenophobia. There are great challenges for us, and not even talking about COVID. I mean, climate change, migration related to that. So many things. We have to find a way and strategies and policies and technologies. However, to not kill people and start wars, that's not rocket science. We should have arrived at this point, I think, by now.
That is a very straightforward answer. Thank you very much. One other question we got: how should relations with Russia develop? Should we not strive for a new peace order here? What's your opinion about it, to all of you?
I have a general answer, partly related to COVID, which is going to teach us new things, as is being said. The world is so interconnected, and I don't want to speak specifically about one country, but there is a need for us to learn these lessons, as Dimitri has said, and we have to come out of COVID. So even if you want to do whatever you want to do right now, it's very difficult because people can't move and everybody is rethinking their future. So I think we need to not die. I wanted to share this book, if you can see it. Can you see it?
Yeah, that was one question also from a follower.
Yes, that's the book.
A little higher.
Not
My Time to Die.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that's
I
the
agree.
message. Pardon?
I agree totally.
Not My Time to Die, and it's by Yolanda Mokasanga. And I think that's the message, that we must not destroy humanity. I'm very hopeful. And in any case, scientifically, humanity is not going anywhere. So we might as well make the conditions, and we have the scientific capability in this century to not live this very basic, ignorant life. We can enjoy our planet.
That is a very positive message. Maybe, Karolina, could you also answer on that question from one of our audience members? How should relations with Russia develop? Should we strive for a new peace order here? What's your opinion about it?
I think it's a very well-directed question, because I come from a nation which basically always makes the same mistake. We think that we understand Russia, and we don't. Russia, like one of the great politicians of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, said, is an enigma. And it's very difficult to understand Russia. But I think the worst thing is to isolate Russia and stop having contact with it. Russia must be talked to, must be discussed with. And at the same time, I think it should be perceived with a certain realism and also with a certain consciousness that we do not understand all its nature. So this is one thing. Another thing, I just wanted to come up with one comment about COVID, because we still speak about how COVID and pandemic and isolation is difficult. But in fact, for the younger generation, there is at least one side of the pandemic which is much easier than, for example, for my generation, the generation of people who are 40. And it is the internet. I mean, we criticize and we state how difficult quarantine is all the time, but let's just think about it as an asset for a minute and say that we are able to communicate here, each of us sitting in one's apartment or office today without any limits. So this also can go to talking about memory, and also to talking about personal memories, like memories of certain persons, not generalized memories of the whole nations, but also private memories of women, of men, of children, etc. I think there is a great asset also to that.
I would like to ask you as a whole round again 2 questions, and then we are slowly closing the panel. If a few more interesting questions will come in, I will add them. But I would like to know, how do you define global memory? Is there such thing as a global memory, and how can we use that? That's to all of you, whoever feels like answering.
Okay, so I'll start. I believe that there is no memory as a monolith. So there is no Polish memory, there is no European memory, there is no global memory, but there are memories. And those memories can be shared by persons or by social groups. And we should be as sensitive as it is possible for various ways of speaking and thinking and feeling about the past.
I would like to add that memory is like peaks of the mountains, that there are high peaks and low peaks and valleys, and we can see some peaks from wherever we are, and there are some valleys we cannot see. So in terms of global history, like the Second World War is a big global memory, that the whole world actually is affected by this day, however, from wherever angle you see it. So for me, that's a big peak. The pandemic is also going to be a big peak for the contemporary reality. That genocide in Rwanda happened to all of humanity. And there are big things happening now, and we can all see them. Whether we agree or disagree, we know that these are good or bad things. I also think history affects us in a contemporary way. So each generation will have its big moments. So like, for example, in my case, we're losing a lot of musicians that I grew up with. Like Millie Small died this week, the lady who sang My Boy Lollipop. But for a younger person, it may not mean anything to them. So they will have their own memories. But it's to continue to build collective memories through culture, the movies, internet, as you've said, the curriculum, education, and to know more about each other. As a translator, I speak 5 languages. And I'm just so shocked at how much I learn because of my access to hearing of the cultures. So we must learn each other's languages. Even if we can't travel, I hope we'll be able to travel soon. But for the young people, travel with your mind, travel with your hearts, travel, reach out to other people, and lower your own hard positions and open yourself to learning.
What do you think, Dimitri? Is there such thing as a global memory? And if so, what can we learn from it?
Well, I don't think that there's some sort of global memory. And I can't come up with such an eloquent picture of the peak that you can see. I actually have to be the I guess, negative warning one here, because there is no global memory, but there's this constant battle of narratives. And it is certainly happening now a lot. You Karolina, mentioned the blessings of having the internet and communicating, but it's also really adding fuel to crude and strange narratives, which gain a mainstream audience now, which is just hard to understand and to cope with. So, in this battlefield of narratives, we have to pay a lot of attention to, because it is impactful.
I do want to agree with Dimitri. That is, when I said peaks, it implies that there are valleys. But I do want to focus on the peaks.
Rightfully so. That's why I had to come across with the valleys.
We have one question here, which is very interesting from Iona. I hope I spell your last name correctly. Dichishvili. How Hannah Arendt said, there exists no collective sin. Do you agree with that?
Well, the German answer would be Jein. Jein is one of my favorite words. It means yes and no at the same time. Of course, from the philosophical point of view, there is nothing like a collective sin. But then forgiveness after the Second World War would not be possible without an assumption that there is a collective responsibility of certain groups of people, including nations. So I think we should be just aware of this ambivalence. So, for example, Willy Brandt's gesture we've discussed earlier, and also many beautiful other gestures. One of my favorite gestures is the exchange of letters between the Polish and the German bishops in 1965 with the famous words, "We forgive you and we ask to be forgiven." All those declarations of forgiveness and remorse have an assumption of a collective responsibility. But it may be also understood to come up with Hannah Arendt once again as a collective reflecting on the past, not on taking the guilt like I am guilty because my grandfather or my grandmother was guilty or my neighbor did something, but rather standing together as if we were together on a bridge and we were looking down on the burdens of the past. I very much like this figure in Hannah Arendt's philosophy.
Thank you. I would like to, yeah.
You need a peaceful bridge to stand on together.
I would like to ask you one last question in the whole round. Let's start with you, Dimitri. What is your hope for the next 75 years? We're talking today 75 years after the end of the Second World War in Europe. And I was wondering, also from your personal perspective, maybe aspects we didn't talk about yet, what is your hope, your biggest hope for the next 75 years?
Climate change, forcing all continents to cooperate and understand that we're dependent on each other and really similar actually across borders. And while defeating climate change, we also defeat racism and live happily after.
That's a nice one, thank you. And how about you, Karolina, for example? What is your hope for the next 75 years? A long time, I know, but
I just counted very quickly. It's 2095, so I won't be around anymore, I believe. But with a bit of luck, my sons will be around. They are 8 and 4. You might have seen little Michał here going from time to time, coming to me during this conversation. So I believe they will be still alive, and I just hope that they will be happily living as citizens of the world, respected as they are. And I do believe, as Dimitri has been talking, I do believe that they will also have a decent life connected with what climate they will live in. I think it's the biggest challenge for the politics of the 21st century.
And last but not least, Wangui, where do you see us in 75 years when we follow your hope and dreams?
Are we gone too? Unless science does a miracle. But I think that we have a responsibility in as far as we're alive to lay, and with our children, like the young Uma who's fighting for climate change, is a young woman, but the button is in the next generation's hands. So I'm really hopeful that they're taking, we have built as much as we can, but they will do the rest. But I've always believed that it's an intergenerational responsibility. Age is the number. So whatever time we have left, we do whatever we can. And I think the rituals and the performances, the literature, the memory, the museums, and the struggles must continue. Nelson Mandela was in prison for 27 years, and he saw hope, so we cannot lose hope. We can acknowledge, but I think the word that I would leave with the audience is the whole question of responsibility. We don't have to deal with guilt or the past, but we can take individual, collective, national, and global responsibility, because what happens in one part of the world affects another part of the world. And coming out of COVID, there is no other way but to take responsibility.
That's a very nice word to end the discussion with you. We're not going to end this live stream yet, because talking about global responsibility, we have also received other videos from parts of the world which show us why we still have to take responsibility. Those were videos which were sent to us via the challenge Histo Voices. And I would like to show you one video we have received from Montenegro, from Isuda Djecic. And let's listen to what she has to say 75 years after the end of the Second World War in Europe.
This is my histo voice. Podgorica is capital city of Montenegro. In Second World War, Podgorica was bombarded more than 72 times. My city was destroyed in all levels. We all know what war means and how can wipe out all human beings. 8 May is most important day for us. We celebrate Saint Marko, who is protector of Podgorica, and we celebrate the end of the Second World War. What we learn 75 years later, we learn how to build, not how to destroy. Human rights are most important than ever, and we all need to build strong bonds between people. I want to hear your histo voice and how you look back and think ahead. Hi, I'm Isuda from...
And I would like to show you another video from Abdallah, which we have received from Algeria. He's talking about the massacre which occurred in Algeria.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Abdallah from Algeria, from the Nathan Network, joining you to celebrate 75 years of the end of the Second World War. May the 8th, 1945 was a day of glory. It was a day where it was celebrated everywhere in the world, and mainly in Europe. May 8th, 1945, in Algeria was a very sad day. As you know, Algeria was colonized by France, and once there had been the war, a lot of Algerians were involved by the French army in order to combat with them. They were promised to have their independence as Algerian independent states. By the end of this war, and mainly May 8, 1945, a lot of Algerians came to the streets in order to celebrate this win, the end of the Second World War, and to celebrate their independence. But unfortunately, it was turned to a tragedy where more than 45,000 people were assassinated by the French army. It was so sad day, mainly in 3 cities in Algeria, which was Guelma, Sétif, and Harrata. Well, this day of celebration, this day of celebration of 75 years of the end of the war, is a good day also to remind that violence, that this tragedy should be a lesson for our young people, should be a lesson for our leaders in order to keep peace all over the world and to avoid all these all these tragedies all over the world, and to avoid all traumas all over the world. Thank you.
So if you're curious to see further videos, please check out our #HistoVoices on all social media accounts such as Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And you can also share your stories with us. We will be happy to share them. And from some of the stories you're sharing with us, we will also produce professional videos, as the first video we have seen at the very beginning from Japan. So please keep on sharing the videos. We are very curious to see what else you have to tell us. So what is going to happen now? After the discussion, we will upload several more videos on our website, and you can also follow field trips to Berlin, obviously digital field trips, but that will be very interesting. And at 5 p.m. today, there will be another live event about the Second World War in graphic novels. So I can highly recommend you, if you have enough time, to join that live stream as well. And tomorrow at 5 o'clock, you can learn more about a project called Artworks. Some artists went on the search to find signs of resistance, and you can see very interesting artworks in connection with that. And all further excursions, projects, and podcasts will be published on the social media website until the end of the year, so it's definitely worth following the accounts. I want to remind you of the website again, called histocon.de, and on Facebook you will find it on histoCONline, on Twitter and Instagram, as I mentioned, and don't forget the hashtag. So hopefully we can meet sometime in the near future in person, everyone, as well. There might be a festival in person. If so, we will let you know on all social media accounts. And we would like to thank everyone who organized this panel and who changed from histoCON spontaneously to histoCON online. That was a lot of work in the background, and I hope you appreciated the result and you will keep on following all our publications. We also want to thank the Office for Foreign Affairs for their support. And obviously, we would like to thank the participants of this panel. I think we had a very interesting debate. Thank you so much for participating, and also to the audience for your questions. And last but not least, we would like to thank... Yes, there's an applause. That's applause from our living room. I hope people worldwide can hear it. It would be great if you're posting right now in the comments from where you have been watching this live stream. So let's make a list of countries. Instead of a question, I would like to ask you to post the country from where you've been watching. That will be very interesting to read that afterwards for all of us. And last but not least, I would like to thank the German Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He has also sent histoCONline a message saying that he regrets that we cannot meet in person this time, but he encourages especially the young generation to keep on working and discussing these important topics. And I have heard his speech beforehand, and he was also mentioning that a lot of young people were supposed to meet in Berlin today, but unfortunately couldn't due to the COVID situation worldwide. But he told everyone that the responsibility is especially with the young generation to keep on making sure that this won't happen again and that everyone remembers. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Please stay home and stay safe. And let's stay in touch on the social media accounts from histoCONline. Goodbye. Thank you.